stand in the way of the truth. That would be the antithesis of all that I stood for in journalism.
You look back on that Sunday Times and you admire the courage of the man. And he blasted open some of the legal challenges to journalism in ways from which we've all benefited.
These children exist in the real world, and we mustn't be put off telling the public about the plight of the children.
What we all learned from Harry is that a single investigation did not deliver.
That was Harry's greatest achievement, I think, to change British law in favour of press freedom, in favour, give more power to the powerless.
The task of editing is to be anything, it is to edit text. If it's to sign expense sheets, I don't want to do it. And if you've got the pictures of the Queen... They're very depressing pictures, I must say.
Morning, everyone. Very good to see you. If that doesn't stir you, nothing will. My name is Amol. I work at the BBC. I've got four giants of journalism here alongside me. Dean Baquet, who's just stepped down from running the New York Times. Dean still runs an investigative unit there. Roula Khalaf, if I pronounce that, I've got that roughly right, Khalaf, who is the editor of the FT and has overseen some absolutely enormous investigations and scoops. Nick Davies, who led the charge on, if charge is the operative word, on phone hacking, which is very timely given events just down the road. And then James Harding, who was appointed editor of the Times at the age of, I think, 14, was it, James? And then director of BBC News, where made some excellent hires, if I may say, and then founded Tortoise Media. We've ludicrously only got 31 minutes, so I'm going to be very aggressive on time. None of your long-winded digressions, please, and no poetry, Dean. But let's start with Harry Evans, because the main thing about Harry Evans was his generosity of spirit, of intellect, of time. I remember when I met him and interviewed him about his book, Do I Make Myself Clear? He was very clear about the power of plain English. James, let me start with you. How did Harry Evans help you, particularly when you were having a spot of bother with your old friend Rupert?
Well, he made having a spot of bother with Rupert Murdoch look extremely glamorous, and so that no doubt helped a good bit. I think there are two ways of thinking about it. One was just, in the ways in which you saw in that film, there were two things that Harry did for all of us as journalists. One was to realise that the law needn't be an obstruction to great journalism, but could be marshalled to its aid. So in the way in which he did, obviously, around distillers and thalidomide, and pursued that story not just in the pages of the Sunday Times, but in the courts, we looked at the Times, the family courts, and thought that was actually something that we could see open up and change a level of secrecy. Camilla Cavendish, who worked with me there, was kind of instrumental in that. And then the second thing was he was really, really a man who understood the value of time. He would take time to pursue a case. And again, Andrew Norfolk, who was at the Times with me there, pursued this case of child sex grooming in Rotherham and Rochdale. But your point right at the beginning, Amol, about his generosity, that was the thing. That was the thing. And when Tina stood up just earlier on and talked about his capacity to ferret out falsity, she has this gift with these phrases, she once described him as a man that you shouldn't, I'm going to hope I get this right, you shouldn't mistake his geniality for pliability. And that was, I think, the essence of him. He was such a warm and enthusiastic and generous person, but he was unrelenting.
Roula, James talks about the generosity of his example. What do you think his influence has been on you and on all of us?
The influence.
Influence of Harry Evans.
I think tenacity, I would say, perhaps more than anything else. I think he's been an inspiration to a whole generation of journalists. And when journalists come to you and say, this may not be quite an FT story, but it is in the tradition, and it happens quite a bit, but it is in the tradition of Harry Evans, you suddenly listen. Because whether it's on the social, healthcare, so stories that have nothing to do with finance, which is more of our specialty, and where young journalists today in particular draw inspiration from Harry, I think it does make you listen and think that this is really what investigative journalism should be about.
Absolutely. Dean, tell us about the time that he helped you.
So I was editor of the Los Angeles Times. This is more than 20 years ago, and I had a very bad owner.
Very bad
owner,
right?
Who kept cutting the budget, and I was having trouble figuring out what my line should be. Where's the point where you say, "This is too much. You're killing the place"? If I leave, should I leave? Which would then leave behind all of these editors I'd hired. And I'd never met Harry Evans, though I had read one of his books, and I called him out of the blue and said, "I'm going to be in New York. Can we talk?" And we had a long lunch, and he just encouraged me to understand what my line was. He was generous in the sense that he didn't, show outrage and say you should walk out the door tomorrow, because he understood the point that if I walked out the door, I would be leaving some people behind. And he said, "You're really going to have to work to understand what your line is and stick to that. It's got to be your own personal line." I just thought I was a very young editor. I thought he was just generous and warm, and his advice carried me through, to be honest.
Wonderful.
I was fired a few months later. But I lasted longer.
Yeah. It would have been a few weeks later.
Yeah, that's right.
Lunch, exactly. It was a great lunch. Nick, did he help you over hacking?
He did. He supported me, warm, kind. I think in the background there's another point, which is that you cannot do a story like the phone hacking or any of these things we're talking about unless you've got an organization and an editor behind you. And the organization and the editor need to be at the opposite end of the spectrum to where most of them are, i.e. not thinking commercially all the time, as Dean has just been talking about, and with a certain sort of moral obsession. So you've got to have somebody at the top of the hierarchy. I had Alan Rusbridger, but Harry's an example who won't let go of something because it's wrong, and that's why we're going to pursue it. And it doesn't matter if it costs. It doesn't matter if the readers aren't interested. We're going to do it. So one thing I took from Harry, in that first memoir, Good Times, Bad Times, which is just sensational about stories behind stories, he looked back on those big investigations at the Sunday Times, and he reckoned you could reduce each of them to one of three statements. We name the guilty man. 2, the arrow points to the defective part on the plane that's going to crash when it takes off, or the car that will explode when you turn the ignition key. And 3, stop these evil practices now. And with his tongue in his cheek, that's entirely moral. And so all of reporting, news and investigation, begins with selective judgments. Why are we doing that story instead of the million others over here? And if, instead of thinking commercially, you think morally, you begin to climb that slope at the top of which is Harry. You can't do these stories unless you've got a Harry.
You also can't do them unless you've got time, as Jay mentioned. And this is a summit to celebrate investigative journalism, and Harry's most known for that work. I want to walk you guys through some of your biggest investigations, and just because of time, I'm going to do it in a very formatted way. So I'm going to ask you all 3 questions, which is, first of all, where do these investigations start? Secondly, what was the toughest moment? And third, do you have any evidence that it actually helps you, not just editorially, but with your business? So what I want to try to get to is some evidence that actually people say people won't pay for journalism, young people don't want to pay for journalism. Actually, that's complete bollocks. There is a lot of evidence that people will pay for this stuff. So let's start with you, Dean. Let's talk you through Harvey Weinstein. This was a huge cultural moment beyond America. Where did it start?
So about 25 years...
Can I just get some water as well? Sorry, while we're at it.
So about 25 years ago, Bill O'Reilly, on one of his rants, ranted about a woman who had made accusations against him. And nothing ever happened. Nobody paid attention to it. And I made a note to myself that that was worth pursuing at some point. So when I became editor of the New York Times, and after the publication of other stories about Fox, I decided I wanted to get to the bottom of this one woman who made an accusation against Bill O'Reilly. We ended up doing a series of stories about O'Reilly and how he had paid huge settlements. And it struck me that was a new device that I'd never thought of. That the way to make these assertions of actions by leaders against women was to actually show they'd made settlements. And suddenly that was something you could hang your hat on, something very specific. So after doing the Bill O'Reilly stories, which led to his firing, I called a group of reporters and editors in, and I said, let's look at these. There must be others like this. So a few weeks later, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey came in and said, we keep hearing the name Harvey Weinstein. So I said, well, dig into it. By the way, speaking of economics, at the time, Harvey Weinstein was one of our biggest advertisers, which I didn't know, nobody mentioned. I could see he had ads, but we didn't pay attention to it. And they just started coming back with these amazing stories about Weinstein. You asked the toughest moment, there were 2. The first tough moment was realizing that the New Yorker was working on a similar story. And we always talk about it, the greatness of investigative reporting, but it's also a competitive sport. So that was upsetting. But the other one was Weinstein wanted to talk with me one-on-one, alone, without the reporters. And
How did that message reach you?
He started calling people who knew me. He started calling friends and mutual friends, people I'd worked with, journalists, people in the world of entertainment who I'd known in LA and New Orleans and my travels. He wanted a one-on-one meeting with him. And I have a hard and fast rule. If you are the subject of an investigative project, you do not get to meet alone with me, and you do not get to meet off the record with me, because I don't want to know anything the reporters can't know. It's like that, to me, that's like a mortal sin to pull out my old catechism. I don't want to know stuff that the reporters don't know. And he wanted to talk as like power guy to power guy, right? Well, I don't want to have that kind of relationship, frankly, with anybody. So finally, he kept calling, and I had 2 conversations with him through the story. One, I just picked up my phone one day, and it was him, and he asked to meet. And I said, nope, you have to meet with the reporters. And the second one was, I walked past the room 2 nights before we were to publish, and he was screaming at the 2 reporters and their editors, who happened to be women, and which is a dynamic with him, we now know. And I was furious, because it was abusive. And I walked into the room, and I told him he had to shut up, give us his comment, or we were going to publish without it. Impact?
Just to say, how did he take that?
How did he take it? He said, you're bullying me. And I said, and I do have a temper. One of the reporters wrote in the book that they were worried I would lose my temper because they've seen my temper. And I kept calm. And I said, I'm not bullying you. He said, well, I'm going to call the Washington Post. And I said, that's great. You should do that. But we're going to publish our story. Impact? It obviously had impact on the world, far more than I ever anticipated.
Do you have, the New York Times subscriptions grew sharply. I do editorship, and Mark Thompson, who was your CEO, deserves some credit for that as well, as do all the other journalists who worked on the paper. Do you have any evidence of a discernible, specific impact from the Weinstein investigation, i.e. people came to you saying, I like what you're doing on Weinstein type thing?
Yeah, I don't know if I can say that there was a specific increased result, but I do think that whenever we do big investigative stories, Weinstein, we did a series of drone strikes the year before getting Trump's taxes. I do think that over time, that tells people we're a certain kind of news organization. And while I can't make a direct link, I believe that there's a link.
Roula, tell us about the FT, because when you became editor in 2020, you said you wanted all your reporters to dig very deep into corporate stories, and you landed this almighty story over a long time around Wirecard. Again, where did that begin?
It starts in 2014 when Dan McCrum, who was not at the time part of the investigative team, he worked on the Alphaville blog, gets a call from a hedge fund guy he knows. And the guy says to him, "Do you fancy looking at some German gangsters?" Dan fancied looking at some German gangsters and starts digging into Wirecard. Wirecard was the least sexy company you can imagine. It's a payments company. So quite difficult to write about in an engaging way. And this, at the end of the day, was an accounting fraud. He publishes the first story. The company reacts very, very badly. But he never gives up. The breakthrough, though, comes about 4 years later, when a whistleblower comes along. The whistleblower is in Singapore, and Dan and his editor, Paul, and our correspondent in Singapore go to see the whistleblower. The whistleblower had documents that could prove that the company was making up its accounts. Essentially, half of the revenues were not there, and through a very, very elaborate fraud. The problem, of course, is that we are in Germany, and rather than investigating Wirecard, the German authorities and the courts turn against the journalists and personalize this to an unbelievable extent. So there's a criminal investigation of the reporters. There is a whole establishment, including some banks. I remember seeing a Commerzbank analyst report which directly attacks Dan McCrum. I think, though, the toughest moment, and there were many tough moments, as the reporters would tell you, and our editor Lionel at the time, was when the FT was forced to bring in a law firm in order to investigate our own reporters, not because anyone had doubts in the reporters or in their reporting, but because Wirecard had gotten hold of a recording from I think it was the owner of a nightclub. I mean, some really strange stuff, saying that that the FT would be publishing a story the next day. How he knew was literally by chance. So a company comes in. It was very tough on the reporters. It exonerates them. In the meantime, however, Wirecard manages to raise more money. It's a happy ending.
Not for them.
For us, at least. Wirecard does not exist anymore. Wirecard collapses. Not only does Wirecard collapse, but the FT is the hero of the story in Germany. The accountants are held to account. They're fined. They can't have any clients for a couple of years. There's a parliamentary investigation. Rules are changed. So this was a bombshell in Germany.
Did you get any uptick in subscribers from Germany?
Oh yeah, massively. It went up like that. And obviously, as with many investigations, a lot of our subscribers write in the comments that they're willing to pay for the FT just for that one story. And Wirecard was the best example of it.
Good for Dan McCrum. Nick, tell us about the origins of the phone hacking scandal and story.
Easy peasy. A guy got in touch with me by email, said, I heard you on the radio this morning, the Today program, you may know it. You need to get in touch. I have something to tell you. Here's my number. Whatever you do, do not leave a voicemail message. So then you hit these moral judgments I was talking about. It's reporters from a tabloid newspaper behaving badly, it's not a story. But once I met this guy in a hotel room, very likable man, who gave me the outline of the story, you can see the moral judgments start to click into place. What this is actually about is abuse of power. You have the most powerful media mogul in this country, potentially in the world. The impact of him on the police is they're abusing their power, and on the press regulator abusing their power. And guess what? The newspaper itself is doing the same. And at the core of most of these stories we're talking about, abuse of power is the thing. And it's sort of massive artillery force lining up saying, we'll get you if you try and tell the truth about us. But apart from the fact that the beginning of the story is pretty easy, there's another point here, which is that although it can be stressful and scary things happen, on the whole, I'd pick up on a word that was used there about Harry. It's joyful. This is really exciting, and it's fun. And that's a lot of what keeps you going. And you can see the fox in the distance as you're chasing. I know it was artillery, now I'm mixing my metaphors, journalistic license. But you can see you're making progress. You're closing in on them. The bad guy, another metaphor. And that, it's so, I mean, I know there's young journalists in the audience, and you shouldn't be put off by the scale on which the thing finally erupts. Thalidomide. You think, how the hell could I do that? Actually, you start with simple stuff, and what's going on most of the time is pretty simple. I always say it's about your imagination, like car headlights in the dark. I know this much. I reckon that must be true. Who could possibly know? These people must know. And then the most important question, well, how could I get them to talk? Again, imagination. I'm going to get inside their world. If I turn up on their doorstep and say this. And it's quite simple in a way. And then when you get over that doorstep, the most exciting moment is 3 hours later, and you come out and your wrist is aching because you've filled a notebook full of notes. You think, yeah, now we're getting there.
There's some hairy moments along the way. What was the toughest moment with that?
There never were any. No, I'm not. No, there was a terrible thing. You know, we were publishing stories, dozens and dozens of stories over a 2-year period, pushing them back. We're breaking through. They're starting to retreat. Andy Coulson has resigned as the Prime Minister's right-hand man. Scotland Yard have set up a straight press inquiry. Then we published this one story about the 12-year-old schoolgirl Millie Dowler, who'd been abducted and murdered 10 years earlier. And we discovered the News of the World had hacked her voicemail. That's got the emotional punch. It breaks through. Other news organizations which had been deliberately refusing to cover it, often because they themselves had been committing crimes, were pulled in. Okay. 4 months later, as a result of the impact of that story, which meant that the police had to dig deeper into their archives, new evidence emerged, which confirmed line after line after line of that story, but through really significant doubt on a key element. I could go into the detail, but I think you'll shout at me. But a key element of that story was suddenly in significant doubt. And to get to the end of the story, at the end of the day, we still don't know the truth about that. On the balance of the evidence available, it's possible we were right, but I would say 70% it's more likely we were wrong. Now, no reporter wants to publish a story that turns out to be false. Well, maybe Fox News. Least of all do you want to do that when you're struggling against powerful people who are doing everything they can to conceal the truth. Least of all when those powerful people publish newspapers which specialize in falsehood and distortion. So it's bad enough. This is scary. But those newspapers are not just saying significant doubt over this part of the story. In the hands of somebody really mendacious like Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail, this becomes the false Millie Dowler story. The whole story is false in the hands of certain columnists on the Sunday Times whose copy reeks of alcohol. This becomes Nick Davies and Alan Rusbridger made it up. Alan sent me an email when that was published, said, you could earn a lot of money by suing this guy. But don't deal with drunks, I think, isn't it? Fully life. But I mean, it's joyful, it's fun, it's exciting, but there are moments that are stressful and it's scary and you need friends.
Before we come on to James, just tell us how consequential do you think the trials that are starting today, just down the road from here? I mean, Tina's timing is impeccable because hacking is about to be, it was indeed on the news this morning.
So, Prince Harry's got 3 pieces of litigation going on against the Mail, against the Murdoch company, and today his case against the Daily Mirror starts. The significance of Harry is twofold. A, he's got enough money that he is saying, I don't care what you offer me, I don't care how much it costs if I lose, I'm going to have a hearing. Do you know there's nearly 2,000 phone hacking cases have been silenced, where the people suing have been paid off before they could get to court. The risks of going on were just too terrifying financially. Okay, so we are moving towards an evidentiary hearing. The other point of Harry is, if, as is expected, he turns up to give evidence, the newspapers who would like to ignore this story can't do that. They're going to have to cover it. It's beautiful. What's the ultimate significance of this? I want you to imagine a world in which we see a photograph one day of a man called Piers Morgan in handcuffs. You imagine a chorus of joy singing around this planet. Well, I don't want to prejudge the case. I mean,
don't prejudge the case. I mean, Piers Morgan does deny any knowledge of.
I was going to say the same.
It's a wonderful invitation to plug the fact that I've done an interview with Piers Morgan, which is running on TV tomorrow night at 7 p.m. So he says at some length that he never hacked a phone. And he denies ever telling anyone else to hack a phone or any knowledge of phone hacking.
Yeah, so you didn't need to. I was going to say, even Piers Morgan.
He's
innocent until he's proved guilty. So there's a great many steps before anything like that could conceivably happen. But the ultimate possible achievement is that, and that's not much. It might make us happy, but what isn't going to happen is that you're going to see structural reform of newspapers in this country so that they start telling the truth instead of dealing in falsehood and distortion. If we had succeeded, we would have that. This country would still be in the European Union if we'd achieved that. But you still have newspapers who abuse their power and using falsehood, distortion, and spite damage this country over and over again.
I want to give James a chance to... James, tell us about Londongrad, because when you launched Tortoise Media, it was the idea was slow news, and then you had this podcast, which I think has been pretty transformative. And it now focuses, in its latest iteration, from your reporter Paul Caruana-Galicia on Iran. But before that, it focused on my former bosses, the Lebedevs. Tell us the origin of that story.
So the story, if you didn't see it, was an investigation in how did Evgeny Lebedev, at that stage a young man in his early 40s, son of a KGB, FSB agent in London, become a member of the House of Lords. And it's really a story, not so much about him, but about us, about the way in which power and the press was co-opted, not just by money, but mostly by parties, really good parties. He invited lots of people.
As opposed to political parties.
Yeah. He invited people to very, very glamorous, very fun parties. And along the way, some of the most powerful people, including our Prime Minister, were essentially brought into a relationship that just seemed bizarre, and then the closer you looked at it, wrong. And the answer to your question, Amol, is it started, I know that we talk about ChatGPT and AI, it started with a slightly older-fashioned journalistic technology, which is called lunch. I went for lunch, and I was asking a member of the House of Lords as it happened about Lebedev, because I think a lot of the stories that we talk about, some of the stories we talked about this morning, they're scandals in plain sight. They're things that you look at and you think, how's that possible? And the member of the House of Lords said something to me, which given his character seemed to say a lot, was it's not right. And I went back and I said to Paul Caruana-Galicia, who's a reporter at Tortoise, I said, listen, all I can tell you is that, so it's not much of a tip. But if this person says it's not right, it's probably not right. Can you go away and take a look at it? And what Paul did was spend the time really understanding the relationship between Evgeny Lebedev and Boris Johnson, the relationship between the papers and the party, and then the process. And the process is really interesting in terms of the extent to which the national security agencies raised a hand and said, we're worried about this. Significant members of the government and party said the same, and yet the coziness of that relationship won through, trumped everything.
And the toughest moment?
It's interesting, I was listening to Dean about that point around that moment when the subject of a story gets in touch and says, can we have a word? And I think it's really interesting the way Dean frames it. And I was tempted to say that, but actually, I think the thing can be really hard, for as much as we all talk about time and Harry's commitment to time, is the extent to which people in power play you for time. And so what you'll get is either someone like Evgeny Lebedev saying, sure, I'm happy to be in part of this, I'll give you an interview then. Or actually, I can't do it then, maybe in 2 weeks' time. Or actually, how about in a couple of months? And that was one side of it. And at the same time, the government kicks you into the long grass. They essentially said, look, we need to go to a proper process here to understand exactly how the House of Lords Appointment Commission made this decision, and months and less is revealed. And so strangely, time gets played against you. And that's as much as we talk about giving ourselves time to do the reporting, we're also, as Dean says, in a competitive business, and we're under pressure and probably temperamentally impatient.
And I think I heard you say on a podcast, you did see an uptick in your subscriber numbers. Your membership actually grew because people loved that podcast.
Yes, the difficulty, I think, with the kind of point you're making, Amol, is it's not a straight line and it doesn't always work. So what we saw, for example, was, London Grad in its first episode did double what we'd normally see. And as a result of that, there was a sort of uptick of probably about 20% just week on week from there on in. And so you do see more subscribers. The issue is that you don't have an obvious correlation between the time and resources you put into an investigation and what you get out commercially. And I think to Nick's point right at the beginning, you shouldn't think in that way. You've got to think overall, what are we here for? And then over time, believe that people will come and support it and engage in it. And a colleague of mine, Charles Patel, says, we also have to be careful. There are only three kinds of stories, right? Stories you should read, stories you want to read, and stories you do read. And we've got to make sure we damn the third.
Roula.
I think James is absolutely right. That's not what you think about when you are working on a story. But good journalism is very expensive. And we have to be cognizant of that. The problem today is that we don't see a lot of local journalism anymore, because whether it is, especially in the UK, the lawyers can put you under incredible pressure. We can withstand it, Dean can withstand it, James can withstand it, but a lot of organizations cannot withstand it. And so they will not pursue investigations because of that. So I think the economics of journalism is actually very important today.
But trust in journalism and trust in news is falling off a cliff. And Dean, there was a bit of polling out from YouGov America just this week showing, actually weirdly showed the BBC, not weirdly, but showed the BBC was highly respected in America, but it showed, generally speaking, trust in news is falling off a cliff. And if you think about the 20th century and you think about figures like Harry Evans, like you guys, like Woodward and Bernstein, who are at this event, there was a time when the newsman or newswoman was this archetype, this kind of cool figure, sometimes played by Humphrey Bogart, someone who is noble, someone who's fun, someone who's cool. That's kind of collapsing. How do we go about restoring it and make it cool to be a hack again? A journalist.
Some of it makes sense. Remember, we've just spent 4 years with the President of the United States relentlessly attacking news organizations that did tough reporting about him. That's contributed. But I actually think investigative reporting, when it's right, when it's true, when it has impact, will help to restore our reputations. I do. I think that I just think that stories, and going back to almost all of the stories we're talking about, they affected the world. They affected change, and I think that you should not let fear of trust or fear of how people will regard you keep you from doing that work. I think all of us are talking about the long game, right? Can I prove that the day after Harvey Weinstein's stories that suddenly our circulation went up? No. And I bet everybody else can say the same thing. Can I say that the institutions that do that kind of work relentlessly end up thriving? I suspect if we look down the line that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. James, final word to you. Can you give us let's go back to Harry to finish with. Is there a moment, is there a story, is there a brief anecdote? I said we can't have any long digressions, but is there something that you think, your experience of him, that captures the essence of the guy?
Well, fun fact, we were sitting here, I thought of a moment that we'd had in New York just when we launched Tortoise. And it was a bit like the beginnings of this conversation we had this morning, and where you introduce everyone warmly. So Harry's there. I introduced him. He was sitting, I think, in the second row, and obviously he's Harry Evans, right? I mean, you can pretend as much as you like that you're not starstruck, but you still are. And he's Harry Evans, and so I give him this kind of gushing introduction on what a wonderful person he is, and what an inspiration he is, and the greatest editor of the 20th century, and the whole ruggedy buggedy boo. And we then get into a conversation about the regulation of the internet, and we're going through a conversation like this, and we're all congratulating ourselves on the important work that we're doing. And 20 minutes in, Harry's obviously bored. And he stands up, and he just goes at me and all the rest of us on the panel and just says, have any of you read Section 230? Who knows the words here to Section 230? Does anyone know what the rules are? Governing platforms, the reason we've got... And he absolutely tore a strip off us. And that was... To go back to that point about don't mistake geniality for pliability, that was the thing about him, that there was something relentless about him, that even amongst his friends, what he cared about always was getting after the truth and making sure we went for the subject that mattered. And so that's why I'm inspired by him still, and I suspect we all are.
It's a wonderful note on which to end. Guys, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.